Dari, hello. It's May 2021, and today I'm going to be looking at the process of converting media in an old form, which is 8-inch diskette, to a more modern form, which is 3.5-inch diskette. And in front of you are the fruits of my labours. Now, this single box contains nearly all of the converted diskettes that took place between 2009 and I think about 2014. So it's about 5 years of work and painstakingly slow. I thought I was going to document this so that other people have an understanding of how the process works. So let's have a look at the payoff, which is the box. In this box we have all the media from my Cromemco vintage computer system. So as you can see, we've got a lot of 3.5-inch diskette boxes. Each of these diskette boxes is numbered and is in a catalogue and contains 10 diskettes or thereabouts. Let's just have a little look. So these are, for example, diskettes from a 1979 or slightly earlier system, which I'm going to show you in a second. And there we are, CDOS 2.17 files, diskette 921. It's in a slightly strange format. It's in a uniform format, not the native CDOS format. So the idea of this video is just to give you an overview of how we got the diskettes into this form, because these diskettes, or the media, started off in a much more basic form, which was 8-inch diskettes. So to rewind a little, if you look at a vintage computer system such as the one I'm about to show you here, this is a Cromemco Z2 system. I bought this in about, I think 1978, 79, certainly before 1980. And at that time, the storage options were diskette based only. In fact, hard disks for this kind of personal computer were not even invented or available. It was shortly to change. Cromemco was one of the first companies to actually have a hard drive in their system, but it wasn't a Seagate interface, it was a special IMI interface, which I never had one, it was just too expensive. So here's the 3.5-inch diskette here, and this is the converter diskette, the 3.5-inch converter diskette, which actually appears to the system as an 8-inch drive. Now the 8-inch drives are not with me, I can't show you them, and I don't even have a single diskette here. They've all been archived in another country, thousands of miles away actually. So yeah, the point of this video is to show you the overview of the process. So you've seen the actual computer system here. You've seen the actual diskettes. Let's now go to a pad of paper and we're going to be looking at the actual process that was actually made to get from these larger diskettes to these diskettes, and for why. So the overall situation is that when personal computers of the 1980s were in vogue, shall we say, they only used diskettes, and the best ones used 8-inch diskettes. 8-inch diskettes, so they're quite large. Later on, we had 5.25-inch diskettes. These are floppy diskettes, these are not hard drives. And later than that, we had 3.5-inch diskettes. So the original 8-inch diskette was 77 tracks and surfaces, let's call it from 0, two sides maximum, 0 and 1. There was also single density or double density. Okay. When the 5.25-inch drive came along to start with, we had 40 tracks. We had single density and dual density or double density. And as you can see, that's not going to be enough to replicate this disk. That later on, there were some double tracking disks. So there were physical drives that had 80 tracks, and they would step the media in half track increments. So instead of so you could take the same diskette, excuse me, and you could, instead of having the 40 tracks, you could have 80 tracks on the same media. Later on, IBM came along and they actually had a different medium. So they have a different physical diskette, which was a high density, a higher coercitivity diskette, which couldn't actually be interchanged with the original drives, and that did have 80 tracks. So theoretically speaking, if you had one of these new 80 track drives from IBM, you could actually emulate an 8-inch disc. But what came to mind in my research was that I looked at some of the vintage NEC computers that were made in Japan, and I found out that NEC moved from 8-inch diskettes to 3.5-inch diskettes. And how did they do that? They used a 3.5-inch drive which could spin at 2 different speeds. So the 8-inch drives span at 360 RPM, and typically the 3.5-inch drives span at 300 RPM, revolutions per minute. So it would be impossible, because of the data rates, to put the data from this 8-inch drive onto a 3.5-inch drive. But there were some 3.5-inch diskette drives made in Japan which had 80 tracks, single density or double density, and 300 or 360 RPM. And they had an electrical interface that was basically the same as used on the 8-inch drives. So bingo, we have a solution to our problem, which is that this media is getting very old. This media started off, let's say, in 1970X. It pretty much had its heyday in the 80s, and by 1990 it was dead. This media, I would say, was around in, was it 1990, let's say? You could still buy, in 2005, new diskette drives, and you could still buy new diskettes. So the cunning plan was to take, and in 2009, so this has already lasted 15 years. So the cunning plan was to take these old 8-inch diskettes and migrate them onto this format using a specially converted Japanese drive. And the way that was done is in the following. So on the Cromemco system, you've got a number of cards, and we're talking about the disk controller card predominantly. So this is an S100 bus computer, so there's 100 edge connectors here that go into a bus. So you have a bus with many, many cards. Okay. Multiple cards, of which there's a disk controller card. And Cromemco used a variety of disk controller cards. There was a 4FDC, there was a 16FDC, there was a 64FDC, and I think the last iteration is 64FDCX, for sort of go faster. This disk controller has 2 outputs. It's got a output for 8-inch drives and an output for 5-inch drives. And the electrical interfaces are pretty similar, but not identical. So what you'd have is you'd have a 34-way ribbon cable going to the 5-inch drives, and you'd have another cable, I think it's a 50-way cable, going to your 8-inch drives. So this is 8-inch drives here, and this is 3.5-inch drives. So the cunning plan was to take these Japanese drives, which are 3.5 inches physically, and rewire the hardware on the drive to always look like an 8-inch drive. So that was done by firstly modifying the drive itself here to always spin at 360. So there's a hardware modification that makes this drive only spin at 360 RPM. So this guy will always look like an 8-inch drive. And the electrical interfaces weren't quite the same. So when the computer actually wants to speak to the 8-inch drive, we're going to tell the Cromemco system that it's got another 8-inch drive, which is actually physically a 3.5-inch drive. But it's coming on this electrical interface, which shares many of the same wiring characteristics of the 8-inch interface, but not all. So there's a few little bits of wire to jumper here. Very messy diagram, I hope you can see this. So there's a few little bits of wire that needs to change the signals that would go out on this 8-inch drive to the physical 5-inch drive interface, because these 3.5-inch drives look electrically, 3.5-inch and 5-inch drives look electrically pretty similar. And they have a 34-way ribbon cable connector, but the 8-inch drives have a bigger 50-way connector. So on the disk controller card of the Cromemco, there's an 8-inch drive, large connector, and a 5-inch drive, smaller connector. So that is how this system is set up. Let's go back to the Cromemco system here. So this Cromemco system is set up so that this diskette drive here is wired on the same ribbon cable as this 360K drive, and there's a separate, much larger 50-way connector, which would then go to a companion disk unit, which, like I say, I've left thousands of miles away. So I can't show you that, nor can I show you the 8-inch diskettes themselves. So you'd start this machine up. It would think, in my case, it has another larger set of drives here, and this would be the B drive in my example, which was configured as the target disk. So then, once the machine is started, we can just run a few simple commands, because it doesn't know the difference between this 8-inch drive and these 3.5-inch drives. So painstakingly, we could take a blank 3.5-inch diskette, format it at the 360 RPM, formatted it, in fact, so when this drive is being emulated in the Cromemco system, this will be looking, it will only have 77 tracks. You can have single density or double density, but why would you ever want to have single density? So I think I didn't bother converting. If I had an original at single density, I think the target would end up as double density, because why not? And then it would also be spinning at 360 RPM. There's another quirk, I would say, something that Cromemco started off with, which they thought would be very clever, but ended up being a terrible headache. And that's their diskette format. Now, in the old days, there was single density and double density. And when double density came around, everyone just switched to double density. But Cromemco decided, well, what happens if you've got a user who's not supercomputer literate, and they put the diskette into the drive? There needs to be some way that the actual computer can tell what the diskette is. And how could they do that? So what Cromemco did is something that they thought was very clever, but ended up, like I say, causing huge headaches for me and everyone in the vintage computer world looking with Cromemco systems, is that they had a diskette. Inside there's a diskette. And you've got track 0 was on the outside. So you've got, this is going to go horribly wrong, here we are. There's track 0. There's track 0 right on the outside. And they wrote that track single density. But they wrote, even for a double density disk, they wrote the first track single density, and they wrote the rest of it double density. And unfortunately, most disk controllers or most software or archiving software just cannot cope with this fact. So when the user put in a double density disk that was formatted for double density, it would actually read a special label that was on the track 0 written at single density, and that label, it had the provision to be 8 characters long. So it was something like, for example, for Chromemco, it was CL, DS, DD, and there was a provision for single tracking and double tracking, but that was never implemented. So there was a label that was written on this disk here I think it was track 0, sector 0, counting from 0. The computer would read this label and it would say, aha, this disk is in fact a Cromemco large disk. It's double-sided, double density, and this was never implemented. So it would know what kind of diskette it was. And this is the way that Cromemco diskettes were formatted. Like I say, this has caused numerous problems all over the place, and it's meant that most disk archiving software just cannot cope with the fact that track 0 is written at single density, and the rest of the disk is pretty much always written at double density. So that's the subject of another video as to how these physical diskettes are going to be made into a digital format, and how you can access them in a digital format. But let's go back to the treasure trove, which is, diskettes 151 to 900. So there literally are something like 800 diskettes here. Each diskette took at least a couple of hours to convert from the 8-inch physical format to the 3.5-inch 8-inch emulated format, if you like. So here we're looking at literally thousands of hours of work all in one little box, but it's done now, and it's also been digitally archived. That's the subject of another video. Okay, Diary, thanks for watching. I hope you're still awake, and I will speak to you again. Bye.